Hello, students. Let's look at the book of Daniel. He's a prophet in exile. Well, at this time, false prophets were announcing that within 2 years, Judah would return back to Jerusalem, and Nebuchadnezzar would return all the temple articles, and all will be well. Well, Jeremiah had warned them that that's not going to happen. They're going to be there for 70 years. So these exiles in Babylon were not put in prison. They were not imprisoned. They were just relocated. So they had to just restart their lives. So Jeremiah had instructed them. Here's Jeremiah 29. He says, "Seek the welfare of the city of Babylon. Pray to the Lord on its behalf, for in its welfare you will find your welfare." That seems just totally wrong, to bless a pagan imperialistic empire with a narcissistic king. But ironically, when you think about it, this is an advancement of the big plan. Even in exile, the mission is still intact. Only the mission is, to be a light to the nations in exile and subvert the empire by seeking its good through sacrificial living. So when we read the story of God's people in exile through Daniel's eyes, we see that exile can be an excellent time for personal revival. Exile changes you. It makes you reevaluate everything. It's kind of like when we were put in lockdown. We had our own social exile, didn't we? We couldn't go to the places we normally go to. We couldn't go work out. We couldn't do anything. It was horrible. And hopefully it makes you reevaluate everything that you do. We had to. Exile changes you, doesn't it? So what can we learn from Daniel and his friends in exile? Well, Babylon was a beautiful city at one point. It contained one of the 7 wonders of the world. It was called the Hanging Gardens. And you can see the ziggurat in the background there to the right. Well, when you read the book of Daniel, you can see that it's divided into 2 parts. There's the first part, which is history, and then the second part are these visions that Daniel receives. It's likely that he received these visions within the history part, but he just tacks them on at the end. So this is our roadmap of what we're going to talk about today, but you'll see that the narrative follows Daniel and his friends as they are faithful to God even in persecution. The visions center on the triumph of God's kingdom over all the kingdoms of the earth. So we'll talk about that. And then we're going to notice movement in the Babylonian government from Nebuchadnezzar after he dies. I mentioned this earlier, that everything falls apart after he dies, but they've got a couple bad kings, Belshazzar, Darius the Mede, and then finally Cyrus of Persia takes over, and he's the one that tells everyone they can go back to their homeland. All right, so let's look at this book. Daniel would have been taken in the first deportation in 606 BC as a teenager. So he's a young man. And all of a sudden he finds himself in a deeply intellectual and polytheistic culture. So he finds himself at freshman orientation at BU, Bethel University. And of course he received a student ID card with a different name on it, Belteshazzar. It's a Babylonian name. It's kind of like, welcome to exile. Forget about God and who you are. You have a new name. You're a Babylonian now. So Daniel and his friends were put into what we'd call a re-education program to become government officials. Why? Because the Babylonian government knew that the exiles, when they saw these people from Judah in leadership position, that they would follow suit, that they would do whatever. So Daniel finds him at BU. And when college gets stressful, students usually turn to comfort food, right? The freshman 15. Unfortunately for Daniel, the cafeteria was filled with associations to idolatry. And Daniel decided to respond with prudence and discretion and resolved not to defile himself and remain true to who he really was. When the exiles would have walked into Babylon, they would have gone through what's called the Ishtar Gate. You can see portions of this gate in the Louvre in Paris, as well as at the British Museum in London. They would have walked through the Ishtar Gate on the processional way, it was called. You can see the hanging gardens in the background. This city was thoroughly pagan and worshipped a lot of different idols. And we've talked a little bit about idolatry, but, why do people get involved in idolatry? Well, I think in a simple sense, we could say that idols are really tools that people use to try to control their lives. Life is uncertain. We don't know what's going to happen. So people usually turn to idols to get what they want and try to control things. But Babylon was impressive, and it was considered the center of the world. After Daniel graduates from BU, at the top of his class, he lands a cabinet position at the White House of Babylon. I know I'm making fun here, but I'm just trying to give you a visual of the kind of job he had. Nebuchadnezzar found Daniel to be 10 times more brilliant than anybody else in his class. So, in chapter 2 of Daniel, it opens with Nebuchadnezzar having this dream. And he sees in this dream the world's kingdom. And the world's kingdom is presented as this enormous, dazzling statue, standing tall and impressive, awesome in appearance. And then out of nowhere, this heaven-cut stone flies toward the statue and breaks it into pieces. And the dream ends with the stone becoming a great mountain on the earth and filling creation with heaven's glory. So Daniel, goes into his office the next morning after receiving this dream, and he wants to know the interpretation. And so he asks all his administrative magicians, to interpret it. And they're like, well, tell us what the dream is. And he said, no, I'm not going to tell you the dream. You just need to interpret it. Where they're like, we can't do that. You got to give us some information. So he refused to do it. So the administrative people were freaking out. So they said, that Daniel guy is pretty smart. Let's call him in. So they called in Daniel, and Nebuchadnezzar wants him to interpret the dream. And so Daniel says, well, let me pray about it. And so he prays, and God gives him the translation. All right, this is just quite a story. The translation basically is that the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that shall never be destroyed. The nations represented by the statue seem enormous and powerful and unstoppable, but they will all rise and fall, like all kingdoms in history. But only God's kingdom is the only kingdom that will stand forever. So each of the body parts of this big statue represented, like the gold head was Babylon, then his midsection was like, Persia, then Greece, and then the Roman Empire. So Daniel says these kingdoms will rise and fall, but only God's kingdom will stand forever. So chapter 2 ends with Daniel being promoted to chief of staff of Babylon's White House to help maintain the information that flows in and out of the Oval Office. Daniel appoints his 3 friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They're the ones that needed to deal with the daily press briefings. Okay, this isn't for the faint of heart, this job. Press secretaries have the tough job of trying to explain to reporters why kings do what they do, like make a golden statue 90 feet high and 9 feet thick. This is what Nebuchadnezzar does in this story. Now, you'd think he would think, okay, I shouldn't do this because in the dream, the thing's going to topple. But no, he's pretty arrogant. So he has this big unleashing celebration, unfolding of the statue. So he invites everybody who's anybody to the dedication. So there's celebrities, rock stars, CEOs, they're all there. Even Prince, apparently. And so the instructions were that when you hear the trumpets and the drums, all the instruments, fall to your knees and worship the gold statue that King Nebuchadnezzar set up. Otherwise, you're toast. So the ceremony that's described in chapter 3 is just ridiculously over the top. And that's when the scandal hit. Everyone was talking about it. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego refused to worship the golden image. So the king was furious, and he said, if you do not worship the image I have made, I'll have you thrown into a fiery furnace. Then who is the God who will deliver you? Daniel's friends responded by saying, if you throw us in the fire, our God is able to deliver us from the fiery furnace and anything else you cook up. But even if he doesn't, only God is worthy of worship. And this is when King Nebuchadnezzar's face turned purple. So he tells his bouncers to fire up the furnace 7 times hotter than usual. So maybe it was the Secret Service that could see the king's head was about to pop off. So they tied up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and tossed them into this roaring fire. Well, apparently as a window, because Nebuchadnezzar's face turned white as a ghost now. And he says, didn't we bind up 3 men in the furnace? But look, there are 4 guys freely walking around the fire, completely unharmed. And the 4th man looks like a son of the gods. When Daniel's 3 friends walked out, not a single hair was singed, not one scorch mark on their hats. They didn't even smell of smoke. Fiery trials only burn away the things that bind us. And I want to quote from Beth Moore because she has such a great response to this scene. She says, sometimes God saves you from the fire. Sometimes God saves you through the fire. Sometimes God saves you by the fire. But let us pray that the fiery trial that we're experiencing right now will only burn away the things that bind us. Yeah, fiery trials only burn away the things that bind you. Now, normally in a class, I would have you sketch the character of Nebuchadnezzar in 3 frames. If you want to do that, you can. But you'd see that Nebuchadnezzar is happy and feeling very proud of his kingdom. And then suddenly God judges him and he acts like a madman eating grass. And then God does restore him because he admits that God is the God of the universe and not himself. Okay, that would be fun in class. We'll skip that. So Nebuchadnezzar ends up dying, not of drinking, but he just dies. And the Babylonian Empire actually rises and falls with the death of Nebuchadnezzar. So the next king, as you can see, likes to party heartily. He was a terrible ruler. His name was Belshazzar. Belshazzar. He neglected his duties. People hated him. He just partied all the time. He openly mocked God by using the temple ornaments during one of his parties. And it was then that, this is Daniel 5, it's then that this handwriting appeared on the wall, not on the TV, just on the wall. The writing obviously came from God, and it signaled that divine judgment was about to fall on Babylon. And that night, according to verse 30 of chapter 5, that night Belshazzar was killed. The Greek historian Herodotus writes about it. So this is outside the Bible. He says, Babylon fell without a fight. The Persians entered Babylon during a huge festival, huge party, without the city inhabitants even knowing about it. The Babylonians were dancing and indulging in revelry all night. We know what that means. Okay. So Belshazzar was such a bad king that when Cyrus came in to the city, the people were actually glad to see him. They spread down green branches to greet the Persians as liberators. And that reminds us of Palm Sunday, doesn't it? Because when the people put down the palm branches, when Jesus came riding on a donkey into Jerusalem, they were saying, revolution. Yes, be our liberator. So Belshazzar was executed on the night Babylon was taken by Cyrus's troops. So that means another king. In Daniel 6, you have this king named Darius the Mede. Darius is reigning under Cyrus, the Persian government. So Darius appoints Daniel to be one of, we could say, 3 presidents or 3 vice presidents, if you want to think of it that way, in charge of 120 governors. They're called satraps in the book of Daniel, but think of them as 120 governors. Okay, that's when the satrap House Intelligence Committee held a secret meeting behind closed doors. They convinced the king, King Darius, to issue a decree. And the decree was, whoever makes a petition to anyone other than Darius must be thrown into the lion's den. What were they doing here? They knew that Daniel prayed to his God 3 times a day. So they thought we could get rid of him if we had this petition. So all Daniel had to do, you guys, is just stop praying for 30 days. That's it. That's 1 month. No big deal, right? No one would know, except, of course, God and the Intelligence Committee. And yet, when Daniel learned that the decree had been posted, what did he do? He went straight home and got on his knees, where he always prayed 3 times a day, by the open windows in his upper chambers, just as he had always done. In the window too, Daniel, well, he always prayed there, so he's going to pray at the same spot. So the Intelligence Committee and the paparazzi, they found a way to make this public. And the damaging revelations about Daniel's petitions was someone outside of Darius. Okay. So Daniel gets thrown into a lion's den. Now, King Darius was nervous about this whole thing. He didn't get a wink of sleep all night. And yet, what was Daniel doing in the lion's den? He made some new furry friends. He trusted in his God, that's what it says. And he actually emerged from the lion's den the next morning without a scratch. What's the lesson here? Sometimes people will see and hear us praying. I know that when I get in groups where we go around the room praying out loud verbally, some have no trouble doing that. Some of us, we get nervous in front of other people. So when we pray in front of people, it can often make us focus only on saying whatever sounds really good or something like that to those around us, like we're trying to impress them. But Daniel didn't care who saw or heard him. Prayer opens the window and talks before an audience of one. I've done many prayers in front of large groups of people, and it's easy to try to impress people with your words. But trust me, the best thing to do is close your eyes and just talk to an audience of one. You've got God's ear. Talk to him like no one else is around. Let your words be simple and few. You don't have to explain to God what's going on. He already knows. So be honest, make your words be few, and have faith in God and not in the power of your words. Well, I want to use a example from the Game of Thrones. You don't have to watch the series or read the books just to appreciate this point. But at one point in the Game of Thrones, this character laments, "There are no heroes in life. The monsters win." But Daniel would disagree. According to Daniel, in real life, the monsters lose. And Daniel 7 is a vision-like dream that Daniel receives. And what he sees are these grotesque beasts ascending out of the water. And so this is the beginning of the visions section. So what are these beasts all about? Well, when you read about these beasts, they're presented as exaggerated caricatures, almost cartoonish. They're awful, but they're cartoonish. They remind me of political cartoons because the hybrid nature of these beasts that rise out of the sea betrays the reality of their unclean essence and diabolical mission, which is to desecrate the celestial and terrestrial realms. So anyways, the first beast that rises out of the sea is this lion with eagle wings. But something happened to him. I don't know. His wings have been plucked off, so he can no longer fly. The first beast represents that golden head in the statue dream of Nebuchadnezzar. This is Babylon. It looks threatening. It's a big lion, but his wings have been plucked. It can no longer fly. Political cartoons can be amusing and we can laugh at them, but the main purpose of political cartoons are not to make us laugh, actually. The purpose is to persuade us. So the second beast that comes out of the sea looks like a bear sitting on its side, and it likes to devour food and chew rib bones. And it's told to go for it and fill your belly. This is representing the Persian Empire. So the Persians took over that whole region into Europe and northern Africa and even over into India. Go for it, fill your belly. But the Persian Empire would fall as well. The third beast that rises out of the sea in the vision is this leopard with 4 heads. It has wings of a bird. And, fat cats usually are narcissistic. They like to dominate. This represents the next empire, the next superpower, which will be the Greek Empire with Alexander the Great. We'll talk about him later, but this is to come. Good political cartoons make us think about current events and sway our opinion toward the artist's point of view. So what's going on? In these visions, Daniel is receiving God's point of view of the great kingdoms of the world. And when God looks at these great kingdoms, he sees these beasts. Nebuchadnezzar's vision is like the world's vision of the world's kingdom. It's very impressive. It's gold and silver and wowie, wow. Okay, but from heaven's perspective, the kingdoms are like these weird creatures. The fourth beast that arises out of the sea is far worse than all the others. It's a hideously frightful beast that has iron teeth to crunch its victims. Any leftovers are trampled into the ground. This beast will make peace, so to speak, by the sword. This, of course, is talking about Pax Romana, the Roman Empire, who will claim to have peace throughout the world by threat of violence, if you can call that peace. But it spews pompous words against God. It's got quite a potty mouth. So after monsters do what monsters do to harass God's people, the vision suddenly catapults into this heavenly scene where thrones are set in a court in heaven. Here we have the divine council and the honorable Ancient of Days, God himself, sitting down. The courtroom is called to order to render judgments on the beastly kingdoms of the world, who make life difficult for those whose names are written in the book of life. And then suddenly, one like the Son of Man arrives in a whirl of clouds, and he sits down at the right hand of God to rule the world in royal splendor. The victory over the monster forces of evil have occurred with this appearance. So here you can see that Daniel has a vision of the future resurrection of the Son of Man, the Son of God, who disarms the forces of evil in his victory over death, and in his ascension he is raised to the right hand of God, sits on the throne, and places the nations under his authority. And amazingly, he's given dominion in the sense of restoring health to the nations and taking care of them and rescuing them from the false gods. So all authority has been given to me in heaven and earth, says Jesus. And what he does amazingly is, in Daniel, it says that the saints of the Most High shall receive the kingdom and possess the kingdom forever and ever. Yes, the greatness of the kingdom will be given to you as vice regents. So this is a wonderful confirmation that the big plan is still intact, and that the big plan is not just about going to heaven. This is a political statement about reigning as king priest on the earth. So Jesus is giving us the kingdom. He's sharing his reign with us as king priests. And Revelation 3:21 says it really clearly. Jesus says to John, "The one who conquers, I will grant him to sit with me on my throne, as I also conquered and sat down with my Father on his throne." It sounds too lofty, I know, but this is the big plan. God shares his reign. He is a God of teamwork. He's a covenantal, relational God who works with his creatures, especially, obviously, his followers, who he appoints to rule and reign with him. So let's finish out here. Daniel chapter 9. Daniel's been praying, and he has an appearance. There's an appearance of Gabriel, one of the angels, an archangel. And he appears to Daniel, and Gabriel tells Daniel that the exile in Babylon, now Persia, will last not 70 years, from 606 to 536 BC, but for 77s. If you calculate that, that's 490 years. 7 times 70 Sabbaths, 70 years is 490 years. Oh no. The exile has been extended from 70 years to 490 years. Well, the Jews began to, calculating the countdown after they returned to rebuild Jerusalem in 460 BC. So the countdown began in 460 BC. So you do the math. By the 1st century, they were more than ready. And so in Daniel 9, the message is that the anointed one, when the exile is finally over after 490 years, after that, the anointed one will be put to death in AD 30. And you can't get more exact than this, can you, on the prophecies of Jesus? So in Daniel 10 and 11, you have some really exceptional visions about the spiritual dimension, this unseen spiritual dimension that works behind the scenes. We don't get to see it. But there is a spiritual reality of angels and demons. And so Daniel suggests from these visions that the unfolding of human history is not determined solely by the decisions made by human beings. He sees a cosmic war in the heavenly realm, in the spiritual realm. There's a cosmic conflict between good and malevolent forces over various lands. So you have the appearance of Michael and Gabriel fighting against the prince of Persia and the prince of Greece and the prince over Israel. That would be Michael. So it's hard to explain and fully grasp, but there seems to be jurisdictional authority of these fallen seraphim that has been nullified by the resurrection and ascension of Christ. So that reality is what frames the Great Commission, the call to reclaim the nations and go into all the world and preach the gospel, the good news that there's another king. They don't have to fall under the oppressive rule of these fallen beings. There's a war over that. Okay. So by the end of Daniel, Daniel himself is in his late 80s. So it starts with him as a teenager. We've gone through his whole life. He's in his late 80s. And the book ends with this. It says, those who are wise, those who trust in God, shall shine like the brightness of the sky above, like the stars forever and ever. And perhaps the takeaway from Daniel is, I'll try to sum it up for you. You know, what we believe and do in life, in this life, matters, doesn't it? So it's important to stand up and live out our faith, not just in what we do, but also to speak forth truth even to power if we can. Also, only God's kingdom is eternal. You know, nations will rise and fall. And we shouldn't get shook up by the news when stuff happens. We can rest in comfort that knowing that God's kingdom will survive it all. And thirdly, you know, the other thing that I think is obvious from the visions especially is that there are dark, unseen forces that are still active in the world's affairs. But we know from the New Testament that what Jesus did at the cross was that he disarmed them. And that the weapons of our warfare now, they have divine power to destroy strongholds and lies and arguments and every lofty opinion that raises itself against the knowledge of God. We'll talk more on this when we get to the Gospels as well as Ephesians. We talk about not fighting against flesh and blood. So I had an exit ticket for you, but we'll skip that. I'll give you credit for that. And we'll see you Thursday.